Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to Lotus Suites 1 to 4. So this is our panel. We're going to be talking about climate inaction and the political economy of climate change. So I'm Jesse Bump. I'm from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm delighted to see you here. Welcome. And we have a fantastic panel lined up for you today. We have Benita Kayembe, native of DRC in the mining areas of Katanga. We have parliamentarian Julieta Kavatuna from Namibia. We have Angel Mendy, who's a parliamentarian in Switzerland and native of Senegal. We have Mina Kong there on the end, who's from South Korea, a former commissioner of the Supreme Audit Council, former dean of Ewha Women's University and academic. And online, we have Mr. Ian Dunlop, or we'll have him soon. I know he's there. So welcome, Ian. Ian is a former fossil fuel industry executive who's now a climate activist. So those are the 5 perspectives plus my own on the panel. We'll start by having a quick statement from each of our panelists, and then we'll have free and open discussion about the problems of climate change, accountability lapses, and the political economy of action. So as we get going, I'll observe that like many of the very difficult political economy problems in public health, there are vast costs that are somewhat divorced from the concentrated benefits, and that makes for a very difficult challenge. So in this case, in climate change, many of the main consequences, the main harms are distributed in low and middle income countries to marginalized groups in all countries, and the benefits are accrued or have accrued to elite populations that are fairly separated. But if you have a cell phone in your pocket or if you have a laptop, then you are perpetuating this kind of cycle where, unfortunately, minerals, cobalt, coltan, and many others are mined under slave-like extractive conditions, often from the DRC. So we'll invite Benita to begin our narrative. As I said, we'll just go down our line with a couple of minutes per person, and then we'll take questions. So please put on your thinking caps and get ready for some fun. Thank you and welcome again. Benita.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Benita, as Jesse presented me. And I am from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And for those who don't know the Congo is located in Central Africa, and it is the second largest country on the continent by land. And the Congo is also known to be one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth. But even though it is known like that for its natural resources, for its forests, for its minerals, it is also one of the poorest countries on Earth in terms of GDP. If we look at the Congo in terms of GDP, it's one of the poorest. And so we have the mineral resources, and our GDP is only around $54 billion, which is less than some countries, which is less than some individuals that we currently know. So when we are talking about the Congo, we see the natural resources, we see the low GDP, we also see some of the poorest people. And now that we are looking at climate change and trying to mitigate the effect of climate change adaptation, the world is looking at the DRC as well. And why are we looking at the DRC first? It's because of its rainforest. The rainforest of the DRC, the country I'm from, is the second largest in the world after the equator, and people consider it to be the lungs of the world because of its ability to capture CO2 from the atmosphere, which is around 40% of CO2 that the rainforest from the Congo capture every single year. And the second thing about the Congo, it's of course its natural resources. As just mentioned, it's cobalt, coltan, everything that is needed to produce the technology that we all so need right now to invest in technology and mitigate the effect of global warming. But when we look at these two things, the forest first, we are losing it to climate change. Every single year, it's being reported that the Congo is losing its rainforest. And of course, so many indigenous communities in the Congo depend on the rainforest. The second thing is our natural resources. Cobalt mostly comes from the Congo. But when you go in the DRC, when you go in the country I'm from, you will see that while so many of us here in the global north are seeing and extracting cobalt because it's going to solve us these issues that we're talking about, people in the DRC are dying. My people are dying. And why are they dying? Because the way in which these companies go and extract the natural resources that they need, it's often done in some of, they don't respect the human rights of the people. They don't respect the bodies, the Congolese population. And so we are always exposed to cobalt. The environmental degradation is bad, the pollution is bad. And as a matter of fact, I come from Katanga, and so many people in Katanga right now are being diagnosed with cancer every single day. Why? Because we are exposed. And that is not just on paper. Like, for real, I've seen so many people in my communities dying. And when you ask, why did they die for? Like, they die from cancer. Why are we dying from cancer? Because we are exposed to cobalt, because we are exposed to coltan, because we are exposed to all those things that people are coming and taking from our communities. So now that we are talking about climate change adaptation, renewable energy, using cobalt for electric cars and all those things, it's one side of the globe only. You know, when we talk about renewable energy, somebody from the Congo like me will ask you, what do you mean renewable energy when somebody in the Congo is dying? Renewable only for one part of the globe, not renewable for the people in my country, which in one of the paper I wrote, I said that was sustainability of the privilege, where we think that something is sustainable when we are not seeing the human cost of it. You know, so many people are enjoying driving in electric cars because it feels good, because we feel like, okay, there's less carbon emission in the atmosphere, but in terms of exposure, in terms of health, in terms of people being diagnosed with cancer, kids being born with disabilities, that hurts a lot, especially as somebody from the Congo. The question now is, why is a country that contributed the least to climate change is dying the most? And why is the country contributing the most to providing us with the natural resources to mitigate the effect of climate change, dying the most from the same things? And that should hurt us. That really hurts me when I go to my country and I see people dying every single day. And when you travel and other people are not seeing the costs of life, that you know, even renewable energy of cobalt, and its impact on the Congolese population. So, and as of now, the Congolese people are wanting and asking for other alternatives to things that are being proposed. We are saying that, you know, when you come to the Congo, respect the Congolese people, work with the Congolese people. And when we're talking about our rainforest and trying to go away from fossil fuel, the Congolese people are also saying, okay, you're coming and telling us that you need our land. First, as I said, respect us. And secondly, invest financially, because we are some of the poorest people on earth in terms of GDP, of course. And to do all these things that you're asking us, you need to invest and give us the resources that we need, because as a global community, we need to be doing this together, and life matters everywhere. So I think that's where I will stop for now.
Thank you, Benita. Thank you. Julieta?
Thank you very much. I'm Julieta from Namibia, as you have been told. Namibia, it's a very big country, 836 1,000 square kilometers, with inhabitants of 2.5 million, according to the last census that we conducted 10 years ago. The most important thing that I'm sitting here, it's why does climate change concern us? Is it really a topic to discuss for us as Namibia? And it's a big yes, because it is really an issue that is affecting us. even if it's not yet so much that we need to discuss it now. The main concerns why this issue is affecting us is that Namibia, it's an arid country with two deserts both sides. The Namib Desert that is stretching 1,500 kilometers, and the Kalahari Desert on the eastern side. Then very important is that the frequency of the rainfall, it's been affected, and this is creating a lot of issues for us, especially with the rainfall, because we do not get water. And then the projection that have been done on our environment, especially the temperature, shows that by the next century, Namibia will surpass the standards on an average global warming or the temperatures by 4. And the scarcity of water is also one thing that because we are farmers, agricultural base, so the lack of rainfall it's having an impact on our food production and the survival of the human being. What is it that, and also the other issue is that we are concerned as a regional bloc in the Southern African Development Community, because we have 2 neighbors that are really affected or being classified within that category. And we don't see it as a far-fetched issue for us also to be affected by the climate change. Due to the other question that one wants to ask is that, does it have any health effect on our people? And the answer will also be yes, yes, yes. Because when you do not have water, the diseases are going to increase. Malnutrition or hunger can strike because of no water. Diseases like cancer and others can also come because of the heat, and there is also a high extraction of uranium in our country that leaves a high level of X-rays also that cause most of the cancers in our environment. What have Namibians done in terms of addressing this very pertinent and devastating issue? They, as normal, have good policies. As we know that policies are really one of the good productions of any country. Most of the developed countries we were discussing this morning with my colleagues and say, do you have an environmental policy? Do you have everybody is having that policy. So we have those good policies that are shelved somewhere in cupboards. We also have introduced the waste management law, where they introduce a payment for plastic bags and reducing of other waste. We have a law that it's making sure that we have renewable energy in terms of solar, the winds in the desert, and other initiatives that we have put in place. Then we also have an environmental land and wildlife management law, where we have been uploaded all over the world to be the best in terms of managing our environment and preserving our wildlife. Then the most pertinent issue that one sits, even with these good laws and other questions that are surrounding this whole thing, is that what impact does these laws have on people, especially the positive one? One big thing, or the core thing, is that the disregard of the community's involvement in the whole process of climate change. because they are not educated in what is processes that is being put in place. Funds are being availed, especially by international organizations, that is supposed to address issues that does not bring the communities along. Let me give you examples. Last year, my city, Windhoek, the corner of wind, if I have to translate, have implemented a bicycle lane for people to bike. In the next 5, 6 months, 7 months that I have observed, and critically also just stood at one point in the morning and tried to see the whole, maybe half a day, how many people are using bikes. That lane cost us, maybe we can save $1 million or something like that. But nobody is using it because the community is not informed why that lane is there. So the lane was put in place without mobilization and motivation from the community to use the lane. Or even the bicycle themselves, the number of the quantity of bicycles within the town does not guarantee it. So I thought we could have done vice versa, giving more bicycles and then put up the line, or using both techniques in order to advance this. The other issue, one of the state-owned enterprises called Nampower, that is distributing the electricity, have given 1 million LED bulbs for house. But the people were saying that it's to reduce the cost of electricity because now we cannot pay much because we have this, energy-saving bulbs. So, but the real thing was that it's to educate the people on the effect that these previous bulbs that we were using are having on the environment. The other issue was our, instead of banning the plastic bags, we introduced the price for a plastic bag. So when people are going to the shop, they will ask, where is this dollar going to that I'm paying for the plastic? In order for them, some of them will come to the shop and just want to know who is exploiting them for them to pay for a plastic bag, rather than knowing that the plastic bag is not good for the environment. So they will go to the shop, they will buy 10 plastic bags, raise concern about the dollars that they are paying for the plastic bag, not really knowing why the introduction of the plastic bag have been implemented. And the other issue that really concerned me, it's we have a persistent fight that it stretches up to 3 years. It was with hepatitis E. Because of lack of water, unaffordability of water within the city. For the first time, the residents of the informal settlement in Windhoek got free water. The main aim was for hand washing in order for us to promote healthy behavior and to fight hepatitis E. Many people did, because it's not a culture that they have been exercising for years, and the scarcity of water is deep-rooted in them, that when they saw free water, they capitalize on using the water freely by making sure that there is containers of water in the house, but they didn't use it for the purpose that it was meant, that this is water that we can fight hepatitis E, but not, they could have used it better by making sure that there is a lot of taps that shows that wash your hands, but it was more about, we bring free water for people that have been struggling with water for so many years, and all of a sudden people start using water. And when the evaluation was done on the cost of water usage in that area, it was so massive, but the disease was still persisting. So that is actually what I mean, that we should be able to have regard for the people when we are introducing programs aimed at climate change. The last one that also are so very funny, or that one can say it's an economic issue, the land and wildlife management. As I said, that we have been applauded throughout the world for a good concept in that arena. And this concept is called the community conservancies. But the people doesn't know why this community conservancies was implemented. They always look at the dividends that this process is having. Some of them still are cutting wood and to use for cooking and other things, but not preserving the environment as it was the ultimate goal, that we are giving the environment and the wildlife to the community so that they can be able to preserve it, make a living out of it. But the component that is overwriting the whole idea of these community conservancies, it becomes more a financial gain than anything else. I would like to later come on, if Jesse allow me to come up with some recommendation on what is the way forward and how can we effectively discuss this thing and get a bigger impact at the end of the day. Thank you very much, Jesse.
Yes, of course, and thank you. And yes, if you're wondering, we are going to get to some solutions. We have a fairly bleak picture, and that's the way the world is. But Angèle, why don't you continue our narrative, and we'll see where we end up.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone. As Julieta just focused on the real, let's say, reality of African context, it's not only Namibia. I'm going to focus as an elected local councillor at the city of Lausanne on the political aspect. And I would like to not to compare, because it's two contexts, different contexts, but I just would like to stress out three considerations that show why Switzerland is doing better in terms of implementing the long-term climate strategy, and why Senegal case may be considered as a sort of country with an inaction in terms of implementing the same plan. So first of all, I'm going to consider the institutional awareness of the climate emergency. What I mean by this is, that the Swiss Confederation, as you know, we are in confederation, the canton and the municipalities where I'm sitting as a local councillor are aware of the very expensive, very high and tragic consequences of climate inaction. And Switzerland's long-term climate strategies aim to reduce greenhouse gases by half by 2030 and to bring them to zero to 2050. This is the difference between Senegal and Switzerland, a long-term project. And second consideration I would like to stress out here is that Swiss take on the implementation of climate strategies and give itself the means to do so and to translate it into very concrete public policies, action and measure. In that document, which defines the climate strategy, it also mentioned that this transition to net zero is carried out in a socially acceptable and economically bearable way, which means no decision beyond what the Swiss can do in terms of substantial effort. So the authorities take time just to know what the society may accept in the long-term perspective and what they can plan and what they can assume as well. And the third aspect is that the long-term climate strategies has received the support of the population, while in Senegal, the difference is population is just like being informed about the restriction the authorities have been taken to just implement the policies related to climate change. most of the population, Swiss population, adhere of the climate strategies, and this is visible in social, for those who visit Switzerland, in political, cultural, and economic life. It's just like part of the compulsory environment commitment of all institution level. In the municipality, our parliament receive idea or propose ideas that will be implemented as public policies, as action, as measure, and we will allow authorities in the municipality level to implement their own policy for the climate change, or just for the better way of living or facing this climate change. Currently, let's say the authorities are thinking about their policy for the next 50 years, but already includes the type of green energy and technologies that must be considered. So let's say the climate transition is underway. Now, what is the situation? What about Senegal? Senegal, through its authority and its population, is far from this, what I just describing, and far from this scheme. In its climate plan, the country is dealing with a very urgent social issues, such as the survival of the population. In Switzerland, population lives. In Senegal, population has survived. This is a mind difference. So in this context, they are facing the decline of rainfall, the recurrent flooding during the rainy season, the advancing desert in the northern part of Senegal, the disappearance of mangrove in a southern and central country. From the south of Senegal, my colleague Soukaina, who gave a great presentation in a situation of north last day, just talk about this drama that appears right now in this context. So there is little integration of climate change into local development policies. The main stakeholders in local development are not particularly aware of the issues related to climate change, even those their population live and experience the adverse effect daily. Of course, let's say Senegal is not alone in its commitment against climate change. It is supported by partners, most of them are among us, development partners who just support local initiative of population. But this is a good step, let's say, forward. But to succeed an ambitious climate plan in a long term, Senegal should have the means of its climate policy. Julieta talked about it before. We used to have a very good climate strategy. We used to have a very good document dealing with climate change. We used to receive with partner great projects that end after 2, 3, or 5 years. In terms of long-term climate strategy, it's all about a societal project that take place over a short period of time. It's just like we need to, Senegal need to think its own project of climate change strategy in terms of long term. Switzerland is 50 years now plan. So we work on it 10 years before, now we are implementing. We're thinking now beyond 50 years coming. And in Senegal, we're not in this step. Population are surviving. They try just to feed their family. They try to find food. They also try to limit, like just said, find the food that help them between after 3 rain season to complete the rest of the month of the years. This is a reality. So when it's come just to talk about, we talk about all this week about the impact on health, but at the same time, the negative consequences of population. We have just to know that in the context of Senegal, population are not in this level of awareness. What happens there is they try to know how do they gonna feed their families the next day. So if the authorities put limitation to say, okay, we would like to implement how climate strategy, maybe for the short term or long term, the population will reply how first priority is just to feed her family, how first priority is to develop activities that may give us money to pay the school for her children or take care of her family. And what's happened? Some of them cut woods, some of them can't just afford respecting some policies implementing by states just because they can't afford it. So where I'm gonna stop is to say that we have a gap, a huge gap between those who are in a step of implementing, like Switzerland, among those who just vote and pass some law, and Senegal, where population and authorities try just to find policy answer to the real life. I mean, go to the hospital, just when you're sick, you may pay. When you are hungry, you just feed your family. This is this kind of gap we need to take into account in this discussion, in this conference. And Jesse, I think I'm just gonna stop on it and just come again if there is question.
Sure, thank you very much, Angel. So we will now turn to Australia via our video link, if Ian is there. Could we switch to Ian, please?
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. The title of this session is really Climate in Action and the reasons why I think that has occurred. And I think Benita, Juliet, and Angel have given a very good beginning to this discussion in the sense of the efforts that are being made in lower income countries to address climate change. The problem is globally that all of those efforts are being undermined essentially by the greed and the failure of leadership in the high income countries and the fossil fuel rich countries. The problem I see around the world is that the risks and uncertainties of climate change are still not understood by our global leaders. We have just had the annual meeting in Davos in Switzerland of the great and the good. A lot of concerns expressed about climate as being one of the highest risks we face. But unfortunately, all of those leaders go home and do precisely nothing about it. The reality is that if you're going to seriously talk about climate change, you have to be aware of what those risks are. The world at the moment is focused on the idea that somehow if you get what are called net zero emissions down to zero by 2050, we will be solving the problem. That, frankly, is complete rubbish. We are going to have to move far more rapidly than that, because for the last 30 years, despite all the promises that have been made in the annual UN COP meetings about reducing emissions, nothing has been achieved at all in terms of the key requirement, which is to get emissions down. They are still rising at worst case levels. Now, that has got us to the point where climate change is now a genuine existential threat to the future of not just one country or, high or low or middle income, but to the entire human race. This is the big issue. Unless we get on top of climate change, then all the other initiatives we're talking about become rather academic. The objectives we have to have in mind, according to the best science available, and this has been around for at least a decade, is we have to get to not net zero emissions, but as close as we can to zero emissions of carbon around the world by 2030. In addition to that, we have got to draw down the carbon that is currently in the atmosphere, which is around 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide, to around 350. We don't have the technology to do that as yet. And we need to do it as quickly again as we can. So this is an even bigger risk. And the reason this is important is that climate doesn't just move in a sort of regular linear increase, or the impacts a regular increase in line with increasing concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. At certain points, it will jump from one state, which has essentially allowed us to develop humanity over the last 12,000 years or so, to another which is much less conducive to human development, so-called nonlinear changes. Now, we don't know much about these changes in the sense of being able to quantify them exactly. What we do know from the history of climate change, the so-called paleoclimate knowledge, that they exist. And if they occur, the so-called tipping points, then most of them will be irreversible. These are things like the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, the degradation of the Amazon rainforest, the disappearance of coral reefs, the same with the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet and so on. There are about 16 of them around the world, which we've known about for around 10 years. It's evident that around 5 of them are already moving to the point of potentially being irreversible. Now, this means that we have to now move to a completely different approach to climate change from the conventional view, which is still pretty much in high-income countries, a bit of a tweaking of business as usual. Yes, we have to now start to use renewables. We have to cut back on consumption in various ways, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of good things are being done, but the fundamental point of reducing emissions is not being addressed. And all the arguments about things like offsetting emissions by growing forests and what have you, these are all good ideas, but they don't work if you have to do it extremely quickly, which is what we now have to do. So we need to reframe the thinking on climate change to recognize this for what it is, which is this existential threat. The response to that is we have to move to something, I don't really like the analogy, but it's something akin to wartime. You have to mobilize, recognizing that this is the biggest threat the world faces. And unless we put in place the sort of changes you would take in a situation where you have this one massive risk, as you do in a war situation, we will not get on top of the problem. Because as numerous scientists have said, particularly Sir David King in the UK, what we do in the next 3 or 4 years are going to determine the future of humanity. And there is absolutely no sign at the moment that our global leaders recognize that that is the situation we're in. So I think we need, in this circumstance, to recognize those realities. It is not a case of taking a doomist view and saying it's all too late. But unless you start to be honest about the risks we're facing, you will never come up with the right solutions. Now, fossil fuels have been extremely important to the development of humanity over the last 100 years. They have produced enormous changes, many of which have been very positive. Not all of them have been, but as the saying goes, you can have too much of a good thing. And we reached that point, 20 or 30 years ago, but nobody's yet been prepared to pick it up. Our governance arrangements around the world are not accustomed to dealing with something that is an existential threat to humanity. We've never been faced with this before. And so it's taking a long time for people to really accept at leadership level that this is the reality we're in. But I think if you look at the extreme events around the world, it's now becoming very clear that these things are happening. You can't sweep them under the carpet any longer. So we need to reframe this discussion. And the question inevitably arises, well, what's the role of health in this? Well, I think health is going to be absolutely critical because at the moment, the fossil fuel industry has a dominant hold on politics around the world. It has grown its power enormously since the end of the Second World War because of the importance of fossil fuels. It is trying to hang on for dear life to extend its cash flow, its returns on the investments that have been made. But in the process, it's now very clear that it's destroying civilization. Now, health, in my view, is one of the biggest levers that we have in trying to break that stranglehold, which is still extremely effective wherever you look. And we need to start to talk about ways in which that can be done as rapidly as possible and as effectively as possible. What is the best way of leveraging health to achieve a massive reduction in income in emission levels? Because that is the only thing that now matters, is to get emissions down. And that must be the absolutely priority focus of everybody who has any real concern about climate, and hopefully that is increasing numbers of people around the world. So I think I might leave it there for starters, Jesse, and be happy to follow up on that in the conversation.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. So for our last panelist, let's turn to Mina and have a regulatory perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for case from each country, including, comparison between Senegal and Switzerland. And also thank you, Ian, for your perspective. It's always very useful food for thoughts and discussion to listening to the real case from each country, from many countries. I'm from South Korea, one of the high-income countries these days, but better known for one of the countries that developed in a very speedy way from a low-income country to high-income country in a relatively short period. And these days, Korea is known better for its entertainment achievement, if you know about it, BTS and famous movies. But and as Jesse just introduced, I have served for the government for 4 years until last March 2022 in the Board of Audit and Inspection, the Korea Supreme Audit Institutions, as the first female commissioner, embarrassingly, first female commissioner in 70 years of our institution. So they had to change some of the construction because to accommodate female commissioner, believe it or not. Anyway, I'd like to actually bring our attention back to the title of our session. This morning, I asked Jesse why our title is about climate inaction while everyone is talking about climate action. And after listening to all these cases and also Ian's presentation, I think all of us are agreeing that we should talk about climate inaction, why it's not working. We have ample evidences that, the UNFCCC is criticized heavily after its so many years of effort. And we know that we're not sure whether we are going to achieve our targets and goals in terms of reducing global emissions. And everyone is worried about the significant gap between what we have to achieve and what we are now in these days. So I'd like to analyze this climate inaction from a governance perspective, because I'm an academic, and also based on my experience as a commissioner in the regulatory institution in South Korea. In terms of the governance, I'd like to bring up this concept. I'm sure everyone knows about this concept of a polycentric governance, which was raised and disseminated by Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel laureate. And as you know, Paris Agreement has been a paradigmatic shift, a significant shift of governance perspective from the centralized governance to polycentric mode of governance. As the concept says, polycentric, meaning it has many centers. It's like numerous centers. So it's basically a structural feature of adaptive governance system that distributes decision-making powers across the system, ensures coordination through an overarching system of norms and rules. So basically, what Elinor Ostrom says is, well, the climate change is consists of, we are seeing the polycentric governance in the climate change actions, because the climate change is a global phenomena, but it needs and based on local actions and actions in multi-levels. So basically, it's an adaptive governance. So it needs to be flexible and learning, and it has to have, or it is having decision-making powers distributed across multi-levels as well as between sectors, public and private. And most importantly, it needs coordination. And also, to do that, we need to have an overarching system of norms and rules. So it's basically multiple governing authorities at different scales. I think Switzerland is one of the best examples of polycentric governance. And it requires and also allows a considerable independence at each unit. So at the local unit and higher unit and the central unit and sometimes global units. And it is often called as adaptive governance because it allows experimentation, feedback, and flexibility. Also, sometimes it's called as a network governance because it's a networking between public and private sector. And also it's a multi-level governance because it incorporates central, local, and national and global level. What are the components of polycentric governance system? Well, there are many different ideas about this, but I would like to introduce 5 components, and we can see whether these 5 components are actually working or not working in Namibia, India, Congo, and Senegal, South Korea, Australia, Switzerland, and any country of yours. Well, the first component is local action. So it is a multi-level distribution of decision-making and action. So it could be decision-making at the city level, sometimes community, city, and national, state, and global. And the second component is mutual adjustment. This is something necessary that to differentiate polycentric governance from fragmentation. So if there's no coordination or mutual adjustment, it's a fragmentation because decision-making is distributed across levels and across different units. But if there's a mutual adjustment, meaning spontaneously develop collaboration based on trusting interrelationships, that will allow polycentric governance to work and produce impact. And also the third component is experimentation, which I think we are observing from Switzerland's case, the city of Lausanne. Because it's local, we can create some experimentation pilot projects that is most suitable for local circumstances. So it allows governance innovation and learning from it. And the fourth component is trust. I told you that. Mutual adjustment can happen based on collaboration and, more importantly, trust between sectors, between levels, and between different units, across different units. So units can self-organize and can increase collective ambitions. And lastly, and most importantly, it should have overarching rules in each unit, independently decided and implemented. So these are the 5 important components of polycentric governance. So we can check whether each country or each place that you are in has these 5 components of local actions, mutual adjustment, trust, experimentation, and overarching rules, independently and at the same time with collaboration with each other. They say there are many strengths of polycentric governance. First of all, it allows innovation. We can learn from pilot projects at other levels and other units. And if it works well, then we can engender trust by working together and through mutual adjustment. And interestingly, the system is very robust with redundancies. Oftentimes, we see redundancy as a vice that we should get rid of. But in terms of, from a perspective of resilience perspective, and the polycentric governance, the characteristic is redundancy. So sometimes we allow redundancies between levels across units, but then it says, well, that's good. Sometimes, if it is well coordinated, redundancy can have benefits. And because it's dispersed and have different decision-making centers, it can be more inclusive and equitable because it covers many different sectors and multi-level and be based on local actions where everyone can knows about the local situation. Well, unfortunately, there are some limitations of polycentric governance. So maybe that's what's happening in Senegal or in South Korea or Namibia and DR Congo. Well, Eleanor Ostrom, she also acknowledged that we need more evidence, empirical evidence, whether this polycentric governance can actually not only change the process of climate action, but also the impact of our actions. So we need more empirical evidence whether it's effective. But the second problem, which is can be more serious, is it can create race to the bottom. So that each unit can compete not only to achieve higher target, but they can compete for lower target. If it's not centralized, if there's no one solid target or achievement, and with voting, with a system of voting by foot, then the system can raise to the bottom, it's lower target, and weakening of regulations. And lastly, and more importantly, from a person that worked in the regulatory sector, it can create an accountability deficit. If in the Kyoto model of governing monocentric, it is very clear what's the target, so what we have to achieve, and who is responsible for what. But as you can imagine, with the polycentric governance, there are too many stakeholders, too many decision-making centers. Then sometimes one person can be, and one unit can be regulator and being regulated at the same time. Then there can be a deficit in terms of accountability. Who is responsible for what? It can be a serious problem because when we have a clear target of legal binding of Kyoto Protocol, well, it was clear what to do. But with this polycentric governance, which can create an innovative way of working, and local actions and mutual adjustment and trust, if it is used in the wrong way, then it can create accountability deficit. We cannot find who is responsible for which action. Well, some people say transparency can be a solution. Yes, it can. So we should share information on what we are doing, what each unit is doing, whether we are achieving abiding our rules and regulations and achieving our target. Sometimes transparency such as market pressure, public discourse, and self-reflections are recommended. But can transparency be the solution? Well, some people say yes, other people say maybe not. Because transparency can just stay as a transparent, but not achieving any impact. Then what are the solutions? Well, I think that's why we are having this session today. What's the reason for climate inaction? As a person who studied and worked as from a regulatory sector, I would suggest that we need to increase more focus or an attention on climate action surveillance. We have to think about how we should design the surveillance. There can be many different ways, and some of the recommendations are like this. Yeah, we need to people to be responsible. You need to be responsible for producing credible information by engaging experts, expert organizations, and also engaging peers, not only experts, but also from local area and also non-party stakeholders, civil society, private sector sometimes, subnational authorities, cities, local governments, etc. And also we have to enhance capacity, creating a culture. Namibia was a good example for the culture creation, and culture for review, create standards for data dissemination, being transparent, and most importantly, being accountable. And lastly, but not leastly, we have to facilitate policy learning. That's why I think we are here together. We have to not only collect data or disseminate data, but also we have to analyze, evaluate those data, and be really serious about being accountable for our action.
Thank you, Mina. So now we've heard from our 5 panelists. I'd like to invite questions from the audience. And while you're thinking about that, please step up to the microphones because our secretariat over there is recording and transcribing things for later learning and use. So please come to the microphones and we'll start taking questions. I think it's really important to observe as we've listened to our panelists that some of the underlying political economy problems are sort of well known to us in type. There's the different distribution of costs and benefits. There are very unclear accountabilities. There are the collective action problems. And as we take stock of these, we arrive at the title of the session for climate inaction. And in a sense, what we've done here is to talk about the usual climate discussion where we look at metrics or look at projections and say, we've heard enough, we've seen enough, we've learned enough, and the real question is, why aren't we actually doing anything? A very common public health question. So let's take a couple of questions and then we'll have some answers in a conversation. All right, thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Jesse. My name's Paul Laris. I'm from the People's Health Movement. And I've just noted that in the time this session's been running, according to the IMF, we subsidise fossil fuel industries by around $11 million a minute globally. So that's about $780 million in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry since this session started. And it seems to me, following up on Ian Dunlop's point, if the most crucial thing we can do now is to reduce emissions, I'd like to know from panellists how you would see the path forward to stopping those fossil fuel subsidies that are hampering change and that are effectively capturing our governments who have any power to make those change. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Please.
Hello, I'm Deepika from People's Health Movement. Thank you to all the speakers. I learned a lot today. I had a doubt. So how climate change is perceived in the north is very different from our realities in the south, and this panel will know that very well. So what we are seeing is also there's a capture not in terms of solutions also. So when you say something like net zero or carbon storage, for example, in this conference, we've been talking about nature-based solutions and almost legitimizing it, even though it has been critiqued and opposed by so many groups across the world. So since we're talking about solutions, again, something like a bicycle lane, it'll be funny if we say that in India, people have used bicycles forever and ever. So I'm just giving these examples at how, in terms of discourse, these solutions have also been thrusted upon us in the South. So how do we make sure that these nuanced, complex realities are reflected in our discussions, but more importantly in our solutions, since we are talking about climate action today, to combat this capture by private actors or wealthy nations? Yeah, I'll be very curious to learn from this panel.
Thank you very much. As many of you here in the audience might have seen, Deepa was making exemplary use of her evaluation form. And now as a participant in the session, it will be a self-evaluation for her. So please keep notes and make sure to turn in those forms at the end of the session. Thank you, Deepa. Mai, please.
Sure, I have two questions, if that's okay. So my first question is, when we're talking about climate inequity, as Benita put it, you also have to think about resource extraction and who is benefiting from it. And so I'm curious about the speaker's thoughts on the so-called resource curse, where those countries that are richer in resources are usually, quote unquote, cursed with poor economic conditions and environmental degradation. So I'm wondering about the history of that and what that means for climate justice moving forward. And in my second question, which is quite similar to what was just asked, I think thank you all so much for your wonderful insights. And I think one thing that keeps coming up is the idea of broken governance. So we're talking about wanting community level action, but because of unfair global economic conditions, some, Angèle, as you said, are trying to survive rather than living. Julieta, you talked about how environmental awareness is different at different levels because of these socioeconomic conditions. Mina, you talked about polycentric governance, and Ian, you talked about how governments are just not equipped to deal with the crises that are happening today. So moving forward, how can governance try to take into better account the political global economy that means that there are some communities that are just inherently disadvantaged? Thank you.
Thank you, Mai. All right, so let's start with those three questions or three sets of questions. We've got one on how to stop subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. We have another about the different views from north to south. We have questions about the resource curse. We have governance questions. We have fairness questions. There's a lot to go on here. So would anybody like to address one of those? Angèle, you want to start with that?
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you guys for this question. I think I'm just going to try to answer this question of the complexities of reality and how we can make sure that these realities are going to be taken into account. I think in every international meeting organizing relate to climate change, maybe people in the international media didn't give much attention of what these key authorities or leaders from the global south try to make people understand. Every time, if you just came back to the speeches and the report, you may say that they try to make people understand that we are facing two different realities. As I said before, in one side, you have people who are surviving. In the other side, people who try to get better and better. Paradoxically, it's in this side you have those who produce more, let's say, bad effects that impact the climate. This is the reality. So there is no, in my point of view, there is no kind of action we will do beyond that, considering what have been said by experts, even Western experts, because they are the most who have voice to just defend global South sometimes. Just consider what global South try to make people understand in terms of suffering of population, in terms of what wants the population when it's come to dealing with climate change. And most important one is the impact, the huge impacts on health that this climate change produced in global South. This is the areas as well we need to just deepen research to better understand what's happened. Because just one example, and I'm going to stop it here, is before we were talking about the children malnutrition. Now we're talking about adult malnutrition. This is one example. You can travel in global South in countries where you have 40 degrees. But when I just take the example given by my mom, he was saying, before when people say, okay, it's 40 degrees, but now when they say it's 40 degrees, the way you're feeling this rise of temperature, for her, there is different in this way. What mom tried to explain me is, there is a change. Maybe they didn't sometime very well understand what's going on, but it's exactly, this is a climate change that's going on. They are the one who faced this challenge, while the others try to do better, finding solution, but still we have this gap of understanding realities. But we have the chance to have those who may just give precisely or translate precisely what this reality means for the global South. So this is one of the answers I may give. Maybe the others may just complain. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Angel, and thank you, Mai, for your question about the resource curse that most economists talk about. So if we look at the global South now, the story of the global South is not 100 years old. And before colonization, I would say, there was a Congo somewhere with its natural resources and, kingdom and everything was good. Everything was good and people were thriving. So when you look at the Congo, issues began in the 1800s when Belgium decided to start extracting from the Congo. That's when the curse that you're talking began. That's when millions of people started to die in the Congo because of the natural resources. And that started then and it's continuing until today. So I love economists, thank you so much. But I think that when they came up with this idea of natural resource curse, they didn't look at the history. They just went into these countries, saw that something was not working and like, okay, this is a curse. So I think instead of calling it natural resources, instead of calling it the resource curse, I would rather call it maybe colonization curse, maybe the colonizer curse, because that's when issues began. It didn't begin with natural resources. And it is continuing because of the systems that colonization left, which are extractive systems where we are continuing to go into this country and taking from them and killing them. Even now that we're talking about climate change mitigation, as I mentioned before, we are going into those countries and taking from them, exposing them to things that they shouldn't be exposed to, and calling it again natural resource curse. No, it is not a curse. We need to do better, and things are going to get better.
Yeah, I think me and Benita, we are actually neighbors, and our thoughts are the same nearly. I actually just wanted to conclude the relationship between the North and the South as climate colonialism, because it does not have a relationship that is mutual, that is actually within the same spirit. One is coming to extract and then go on a global forum and say that we should save the environment while you left open pits out there where people are dying and becoming so sick because of your deeds that you have left there. So to me, I think it's really something that, and I didn't attend any COP. I have been 20 years in Parliament nearly, but I did not attend any COP, but I don't know what the discussions is all goes about there, because every year you will see big delegations, even from the poorest of the poorest country that cannot feed their own people, have delegations that goes to COP just to go and discuss the environment and the climate change things and come back, and the next day you are going. So it's one thing that I will really like to understand. Maybe I need to do a research on what is it that has been discussed and what impact have it bring. The one thing that my colleague there said, it's the complexity of the whole discussion and how we are implementing it. This approach, I know that global crisis, the climate change issue, it's a global crisis, but it does not need one shoe fits all approach. It should be based on the needs of the people and what is issues that are affecting that specific people. Even within the SADC, or the Southern African Community Development, we are neighbors with South Africa, with Malawi. That has been rated as very risky countries in terms of that. But their approach will never be the same like ours, because the environment and other aspects differ. So it is why we should be able to discuss programs that are manageable within our expertise and how we can implement it. The priorities also differ within one country to another. Like for instance, I had just brought an example of cycling, which is culturally not an issue that we do as Black Namibians. Maybe the white community in Namibia does that as a form of exercise. But when you start taking resources and put it in where, because we are also divided according to suburbs, there is white suburbs and black suburbs that are still existing even if we have been independent for 30 years. So you can't bring things that doesn't work in one community and spend money on it. Rather than bringing water to those communities, you go and make lanes for cycling that are not used. So even in our own operations and also an assessment, I think that it's very, very important to see what is our priorities. And also the fact that most of African countries are more affected by other catastrophes rather than issues of global crisis that layman also understands better, that could be dealt with. So and I like Ian because he actually just said, because I said I will come back with recommendation, but I wanted to say that let's be realistic, let's grab the low-hanging fruits and capitalize on making an impact on whatever area we can, rather than always just follow policies that are not designed for us with a lack of resources on top of that. So it's not going to help us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mina, did you want to hop in on that?
Well, yeah, I felt I have to answer for the broken governance question. I agree. We all are facing the problem of broken governance, and we all know that numerous ideas and efforts to reform governance because of all these inactions and problems that we're seeing. And we tried centralized, monolithic governance. We tried dispersed and decentralized governance. And polycentric governance, in a way, a hybrid form. So it's like mixture of everything, having centralized at the global level and national level at the same time at the local level. Well, for me personally, my personal opinion is best governance is a system of engagement. So we often think that democracy is based on majority rule. I don't agree. It's not a majority rule. It's listening to minority opinions. That's democracy. And more importantly, democracy is actually an engagement, not only listening to, but engagement of minority voices and minority units. So, in that perspective, I think this is a great place for not just listening, but engaging different units, different countries, different experiences. But then I'd like to make a bold suggestion, proposal, meaning that we can invite someone from the future, someone from year 2050. If we have someone here as a panelist from 2050, what's going to be her and his reactions or answers to this question, to these questions, to our panelists? There is an actually effort to do that. In some countries, there has been created a committee for future responsibility and invite someone like myself taking the role of a person from the future, year 2050. And what would be my question to the panelists and policy decision makers? So again, I don't have a definite answer for how to fix our broken governance, but at least we should make an effort to create a governance system of engagement. And I think this is a good start for that. Thank you.
Great. I know we got a couple more questions coming. Ian, can I ask you to respond to the fossil fuel subsidy question Paul raised?
Yeah, certainly, Jesse. I think both the subsidy question and the question of resource curse and what have you, I can wrap up in one thing. The subsidy level around the world for fossil fuels at the moment, according to the IMF, is about $6 trillion a year, which is essentially being paid to fossil fuel companies to destroy the planet. That's what's happening. The problem is, in terms of getting rid of it, which we have been promised by organizations like the G20 repeatedly, and they've done nothing about it. The real problem with this is that the fossil fuel industry still dominate politics around the world to a far greater extent than people really understand. That has allowed ideology to ensure that the real implications of climate change were swept under the carpet for the last 30 years. And that is still the case today if you look at the COP meetings, the Davos meetings, and so on. The one thing that all countries must now be doing to address both the subsidy issue and the resource curse issue in a sense is they must be brutally honest about what the implications of climate change are going to be for their particular circumstances. The knowledge is out there, the scientific community have made it available, but it is not being picked up by the political system, in large part because the fossil fuel industry has them under their thumb and is determined to ensure that that knowledge will not be acted upon. Now, that's managed to stop things happening for 30 years. What we're now seeing is the absolutely disastrous impacts of climate in countries like Pakistan recently with the floods, in India with extreme heat, but not just in lower income countries, also in the United States and the Northern Hemisphere, around significant parts of Europe. Everybody is now confronted with a totally different reality from anything they've ever experienced before. The evidence is there. We need a form of governance to emerge, which is in fact not your conventional democracy or authoritarianism, but is a form of government of national unity, which recognizes that this is the one threat above all we have to solve, and you won't do it by playing conventional politics.
Right. Thank you, Ian. Okay, so we've got 4 more questions, or 5 more. Fran, I think you're second.
Okay.
Would you like to take the first question, and then we can... No, it's okay. We're all polite here.
All
It's
right.
fine.
Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
please go ahead.
So I want to say thank you to the panelists for raising a lot of really important issues that I can't get out of my head. And to be honest, this gap between, outcomes and policy outputs and action is not new. This is, I think, a really important space to have this conversation, especially with the climate and health community. And it's something that, to me, is really sad that the climate and health community has heard these conversations from frontline communities and from people who experience the impacts of climate change on their health in these type of fora many, many times. And isn't this the space that we should be having these conversations with them to say, you need to do things differently? What we've been seeing is that now the climate and health community, especially at the international level, have been taking these efforts or this space to do top-down approaches yet again and creating these large frameworks or guidelines that don't work at a local level and they're not applicable in many contexts. So I want to ask each of you if you can say one thing to those people who are here at this conference. What can they do differently? What should they be doing that is not sticking to what they're comfortable with, the status quo of this top-down framework approach, and actually take into account the voices and the actions of people on the ground so that it's actually implementable in the Global South? Not copying and pasting these Global North approaches and trying to bring them into the Global South and expecting them to be what works and wasting resources to do that. So, thank you.
Thanks. And can you identify yourself for the audience?
Yes, sorry. I'm Amanda Quintana and I'm with LSHTM and APT. Thank you.
Great. Fran, you're next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Fran Baum from the People's Health Movement and University of Adelaide in Australia. Ian, I think, and everybody's laid out the problem really well, that we're on this planet going around the sun. We've got this major issue that we're kind of ruining life on the planet, and we're really not, as a collective, doing anything about it. I think the one element we really have to look at, and I see Sharon over there, Sharon and I worked looking at why action doesn't on health inequity, and we put a lot of emphasis on power. So, for instance, in multi-stakeism, it's not enough just to say we have to get people to come together. We have to unpick where power sits. Why is it that the fossil fuel can hide behind doors and develop its policies? How is it that they can be so powerful that they got an Australian Prime Minister holding up a piece of coal in our parliament and saying this is the future? How is it that the Congo has had all its resources ripped off rather than being able to benefit from them and the people of the country benefit? So I think we need a piece-by-piece power analysis and then ask the question, how do we disrupt those positions of power that are often invisible, not evident? How do we ensure that the fossil fuel industry can't continue to do what it's done? We did it with the tobacco industry. I think that was easier, but it's still a battle. They're still fighting back, but it's going to be a much bigger battle with the fossil fuel industry. And it's not going to be about consensus, I don't think. It's going to be because people get out on the street and protest. They raise issues. Yesterday we had a session with someone from the fossil fuel industry. There was a lot of unhappiness that they were there because the feeling was that they play to a certain playbook and they exert their power in all sorts of different ways. So I think I'd want to say to everyone, think about how is power happening in the systems that you're part of? How can that be disrupted? And it would be great to hear if you've got some ideas on that.
Thank you, Fran. Ron, I think we've got 2 there at the back mic next.
Okay, well,
Then
thank you.
Sharon will come up here to you in front, and then Sukanya.
Well, I'm kind of pleased to sort of see that we're getting around to the issues of governance and government and kind of the processes by which we might create some political change. I remember from the 1970s that we used to have activists had a wonderful saying, there's one struggle, many fronts. So I think as much as I agree with Ian Dunlop's idea that we need to have a different system of governance, that we need to have more grassroots kind of communitarian forms of engagement, and that we need to keep the pressure up, as Fran says, through various forms of political activism. But I think we also sort of are facing kind of issues of a crisis in liberal democracy. So I want to just address about how we might consider trying to, as in a sense, occupy our liberal democratic processes for those countries that are still working with liberal democracies. A little story in terms of Canada. Canada, like many other countries, has made frequent commitments to get rid of its subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Now, finally, our federal government has actually put some firm deadlines, very firm deadlines over the next couple of years to actually get rid of all direct subsidies, not the indirect ones, the ones that kind of where the government has to pay for correcting all the damages that the fossil fuel industry creates. And this was thanks to a minority government where the balance of power sits with a small social democratic government federally that basically got that as an agreement in order to keep up the liberal government or kind of more centrist kind of government in power. But meanwhile, we have a petro province in Canada, a petro state. It's called Alberta, and that's the home of the Athabasca tar sands. What we've witnessed in Alberta is through manipulation of electoral boundaries that a party was able to take power in that province without having an actual popular vote percentage. And it is a far-right party that's now put in place its own provincial legislation, which have to be tested all the way up to our Supreme Court level, but basically says anything the federal government says and has regulation or federal law that it puts in place that damages our own interests, meaning the fossil fuel industries, they'll just simply ignore it. They'll just bypass it entirely. And that raises a problem that one of the things that we're confronting right now is this rise of an alt-right, illiberal political movements. They're a minority, but they're basically sort of entrenching themselves into our liberal democratic platforms. So my suggestion, because here is that, and I think that the bad news is also the good news. The bad news is that it's going to continue to get worse. Climate chaos is going to get worse and worse and worse. And that's the point that Ian made. It's affecting everybody. It's affecting people in Canada. We're getting floods. We're getting disasters. We're getting huge storms. We're kind of losing forests. It's massive. And it's costing a lot. And it's affecting people's day-to-day lives in a much more profound way than we saw even, let's say, 5 years ago. Now, as that happens, I think there's going to be an increasing kind of public discontent with the politics as usual. And my suggestion is that we need to have very strong activists, probably folks a bit younger than me, to get out there and run for political office. Because at some point, there's going to be moments called where we could see a transition in the kind of the governments that we have, just the liberal democratic governments, that might be much more in line with the kind of policies that we know need to be put in place. So that's my encouraging thought, is that maybe it's possible for the activist area to basically take over the liberal democratic process.
All right, great. We're on it. Good. Please. Thank you, Ron.
Okay. Following that, my name's Alicia Draper. I'm with the Wellcome Trust. And thank you all for traveling to Bangkok. It's been a real privilege to have you here as a panel. Very not easy to answer, but simple question is, from your perspectives as policymakers and politicians, what's the research, the evidence base, the expertise that you need from this community, the public health community, to bring health into the heart of climate action within your country's context?
Great. Thank you, Alicia. Sharon?
Thank you, Sharon Friel from the Australian National University. Thank you very much for the panel discussion. I suppose what really has struck me through the discussions and the broader discussions now is a sense of local level action where communities across the world having to and innovating and learning to adapt to climate change that has been created by others. And so all of the responsibility for all of that other action falls on local communities. So the thing that worries me when we have such a discourse around local level action is local communities then have to bear the responsibility for something that they didn't cause. So I'd love just a kind of a response from the panel around that, because I think it just continues to perpetuate the global inequities that climate change is just going to, or is exacerbating. Because, of course, laying over all of that, what we've been speaking about is the global political economy that drives all of this. And what we continue, I think, what we continue to have is a lack in the discussions. We have local level action, we have sort of national policy discussions, but we actually just don't have the folks who have the structural power to make any difference to these sorts of global level problems. And climate change knows no boundaries, as we've discussed. So how do we get those folks, how do we get the bankers, how do we get the G20, the various people that we've been talking about, actually talking about climate and health and their responsibility, so that it's not just the local communities that have to do it all. I see it where I live in Australia. We're talking about local community resilience, and frankly it's not good enough, because it puts all the pressure on local communities to have to deal with things that they did not cause. So how do we do that? And which is where I think the coalitions, the social movements like PHM become so important in pushing up. But I think always, always, always in our global health discussions is we have an absolute blind spot for the folks with structural power having to sit and tell us what they're going to do. So I want the G20 folks on that panel telling us actually what they're going to do. They sort of come along to these conferences and then they go off and they have their meetings out in the corridors. They're not in the room or on the panel. And my final point, and I suppose a reflection for you, is we've been having a discussion yesterday, and we'll probably have more of it today, is we're addicted to fossil fuels. We're addicted to using, so it puts, again, it's the power, Fran spoke about power, it's the power of discourse, the power of framing. We're not addicted, that's a manufactured addiction that comes from the fossil fuel companies. So let's not own the addiction, let's put it back onto the fossil fuel companies. Please, let's not as a public health community talk about us being addicted to fossil fuels. So how in local national level action, how do we change that discourse? How do we claim the power to talk about it's the environments, it's the industries, it's the investors, it's the corporations that have manufactured addiction. It's not an inherent thing within us as individuals. So I'd love reflections around that.
Thank you. We've got all kinds of rich topics. Let's take our last couple of questions. Sukaina, why don't you start, and then we'll go there in the back. And then our panel will have its work cut out for us.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I'm Sukaina Sila, and I work at the Global Fund. And thank you to the panelists for the wonderful insights that you've provided. My question, Juliana, you sparked my curiosity when you mentioned COP discussions and when you mentioned our country's participation in these COP meetings. And as you may or may not know, President Macky Sall of Senegal, as the head of the AU currently, has been pushing, along with other African Union states and small island nation states in the Caribbean, for funds to be set aside for countries in the global south facing these consequences of climate change to be supported in climate adaptations. And as some of you may know, if you follow the COP discussions, at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, they reached an agreement to set aside a set of funds for loss and damage for vulnerable countries. The initial target for that fund is roughly about 100 billion, and what has been pledged so far is only about 230 million. Now, assuming that these funds actually do materialize, and at the next COP, the 28th COP, there are discussions and way forward on how these funds, if they do materialize, will actually be utilized. There will actually be a mechanism for how the funds will flow, will be distributed, allocated. Do you think, and I'd like to hear from the panelists on this, is this just another ploy? Another way of distracting from the real issues of climate change? Or do you think that there are opportunities with these types of funds, with the right governance principles, the right types of actions at country level for countries in Africa, in the Caribbean, to use those funds to actually make the kinds of recommendations which you think will address this issue of inaction? Or is this just simply another way of distracting us from the real issue and flowing funds in systems that are simply not going to lead to actual concrete use for communities and for climate adaptations in our countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Sukaina. Please.
Hi, I'm Modi Mwatsam, also with Wellcome Trust. Thank you for the really fantastic panel. I learned so much. And I guess my question is, so a running theme in most of your talks was about the lack of community engagement in developing solutions to the climate change and health problem. And I was wondering, from your experience, do you have any practical examples of where there have been solutions that were implemented with the communities being involved, bottom up, either in climate change and health or any other sector that we can learn from as we try and solve this common challenge? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now I promise, I'm not really a mean moderator, but we're going to have to stop our questions after Ritu to give our panelists a little bit of time here. So please, and then we'll go to Ritu and we'll turn to the panel.
Hi, I'm Susie Mercado from the Hawaii Public Health Institute. And I just wanted to respond a little to Ian's point. I do agree completely that health is one of the most powerful leverages we can use to change from inaction to action. And I think our speakers have spoken about water, cancers, all kinds of diseases. What should we be doing in terms of the theme of this conference, a new health agenda?
Thank you. Ritu?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Ritu Sedana from WHO. There are many networks of cities that have been promoted not only by UN agencies like WHO, but foundations and others, healthy cities, age-friendly cities, eco-cities, there's many. So are those networks, and I understand there are some city mayors, they belong to 10. Do these networks help? Are there any examples where they have expanded a bit more to the global south? I know maybe not as much as we would like, but I would really be interested to see how those could be useful if they are useful. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So we got a network question here to end. Juliet, I see you getting prepared. Do you want to start? I'll have to ask, just for really quick answers so we can get through a few of these. We got about 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. The first one is Amanda. That I just wanted to say, because she asked us to give an example or just one suggestion, that the climate change and in the relation to health, it can not be spoken in general any longer. It should be an agenda that is explicit, that knows what we want in our health sphere when it's coming to climate change. So it should not be just a topic among other topics. It should stand out. It should have that significance. And also within our setup, like for instance, I was a deputy minister of health for 5 years, and the environmental health component in our ministry is just a fracture that does not even get 1% of the resources allocated to the ministry. So that issue, I think, need to be accelerated, that we need to discuss environmental health and other related health issues, especially primary health care, in the whole aspect of the public health, in order for the money to go to move from curative services to the prevention and promotion of health. The last one that I wanted, because it's about politics, and as a politician, I think I need to answer or to also put my input from Frank, Pierre, and Sukani, the COPE health, the COPE and the political will. There is always a misconception when people are talking about the political will, because when they come back from the COPE and other international platform where they sign treaties, we think that we have succeeded and it shows the political will. But with lack of understanding, with lack of scrutiny of what you have signed for, we actually just another show that we are bringing back home, because in most cases they will say that, no, we just went to a certain event. I just don't want to put COPE in perspective so much, but then they come back and we will tell the world that we have the political will, we are going to follow ABCD, but all the policies that we are replicating and bringing into effect does not speak to the environment where we found ourselves. Most of the understanding also, it's very limited to the subject matter on the table. So we the politicians and the leaders within our world should start understanding the broader picture and bring it back home, implement it according to what the home needs rather than in general. Thank you.
Great, Angel.
Yeah,
And then
thank you so
Benita.
much for questions we received. I'm just going to begin by one of, I think, Lindsay's side, the question about if we have, as people from the South, define one key aspect that the population, global South population, need, what we're going to give. I'm going to take the question in the other side. It just, if we really try to know or want to know what is the priorities of this global, let's take example of Senegal. It's just like try to do a questionnaire and give it to the population, maybe take 10 social issues, including health and climate change. You will better know overall what kind of social issues they're gonna put on the top, or what kind of social issues gonna be in the down. The example, by doing one research on COVID-19 and asking population where they're gonna place it in their priority, health priority, make me just believe that if you did the same example by taking the social issues, we will find means of subsistence in a top, the rent, children's school, the cost of living, the health care. I don't know where the climate change issue is going to be, but we will quickly know what are the priorities of those people that are facing climate change right now. But at the same time, what they're going to put at the top and what they're going to rank on down. The other question is, if you really want to know about the successful of policy, climate change policies and or plan in African countries, let us take this example. I'm sitting in a parliament of Lausanne, you know, Switzerland, you know, the canton of Swiss as well, Switzerland, and the power of in municipality level. When we vote for the transition, energy transition, and we accept this law or the project, we put money. I'm sitting as well in the financial commission in the municipality parliament. I know how much money we used to give just to reach one objective we want. These objectives or these social issues come from the base of population. So that, it's the will of the population we take into account and put money to resolve this problem. Now, in the case of Global South, what's happened? We just try to ask them to rank their needs, but do they receive enough money to do as Switzerland is doing with putting billions of money to reach the climate strategy? No. It's bringing me to ask the question of, do these networks help? Of course, networks help for the short term, but a long-term policy need much resource. These resources, African countries don't have it. The Global South don't have it. So projects may succeed, but long-term project partner don't give fund for that. This is a key realities. If you want the global strategy become like priority, give money, enough money for that. I'm not saying that we need always to give money to state because sometimes there are corruption issues, etc. But all we're talking about, successful or failing of policy, as a situation of local community, all of this are based on the lack of resource. And we all of us here know where the money is and how we're gonna do to resolve the Global South problems. Thanks.
Thank you. Benita?
Thank you, Angel. And I wanted to respond to the question about bottom-up approach and localized response to climate change. And when we are talking about bottom-up approaches, I actually do my research in the DRC and I work with artisanal miners communities. And what was interesting to find out is how the language that I use as someone with academia is different than the language that they use to describe themselves and the issues they face. So compared to someone who is working in mining in the Congo, and all of us here, I think that we are less than 1% of maybe of the population. We can see ourselves here as those who can be considered to be up. So when we are writing our papers, when we are going back to our offices, what are the languages that we use? Who do we work with to make sure that the language that the people we are trying to work with, the language is represented on our papers? For example, I'm working with artisanal miners. I'm like, oh, you're an artisanal miners? And they're like, no, there's nothing hearty about what I do. Like, I'm a digger. That's what they call themselves. When you talk to them about the global exchange market, they have another understanding. They have other words. So it is up to me as a researcher to take that, work with them on how they want me to do, what they want me to do with it, how they want me to explain it to other people, so that when I go back to their communities with these papers, with this policy recommendation, they will know that what I am talking about is what they asked for. So as people here even talking about what can we do going from here, we have to make sure that we are working with these communities. We are so, it's like we are the same people, but we're different because the disciplines that we work in are different. Their experiences sometimes are way different than what we know. And so if we can hire them so that they can explain to you what they know better than you. If you need more explanation about their countries, you should go to them. If you need to publish papers, just don't publish because, be the expert that you are from the global north. Like, have them work with you so that when publication are going to do things that are needed for policy implementation, when they're going to come up, their voices and their languages are going to be represented. I think that is one of the ways we can go about trying to get that bottom up approach, and coming to these conferences is good. We are here now. What can we do to make sure that next year they are also there? It's just not enough to have all of us here again next year, the same people. What can you do in your company to make sure that next time you are here, you're coming with someone from your local community so that we can hear the language as well?
Thank you, Benita. A last word, Mina?
Okay, I see that we have only 45 seconds. The greatest thing about this kind of panel is not only learning from panelists, but great questions. Thank you so much for the great questions. Well, I want to answer all the questions, but I just can't do for 2 questions. One is about putting accountability burden to local level. I agree. That's the typical, very good example of accountability deficit. What can you do about it? Well, it's not an easy answer, but I think it's a matter of balancing. I'm afraid of height, but I'm climbing. I'm exercising inside indoor climbing because I love to learn how to balance my weight. It's a matter of balancing between local level and global and transnational level. We have to have, while we're empowering local level actions and local communities, we definitely need transnational, global level of regulations, targets, monitoring, reviewing, and NCDs. So, and also in terms of network of cities, yes, health cities network are a good example, but I heard there are some worries and concerns about those networks because those are mostly in the northern sphere with relatively sufficient resources. So we're not sure whether it's applicable to other small cities in the southern sphere. So thank you so much for great questions.
Thank you, Mina. And Ian, how you got a 10-second goodbye for us? Sorry about that, but we're running out of time.
I think what this conference needs to take away is the following. You have got 7 years to get to zero emissions around the world. That is a task that is massively different from anything that anybody is prepared to talk about officially. We are spending $6 trillion subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. We spend $2 trillion a year on defense. All of that money should be going into fixing climate change. It won't happen with conventional politics. It needs a complete reframing of the way we address this to avoid what is really a genuine existential threat to humanity. That is going to require mobilization of a completely different form. Health is a critical issue in addressing that. And what I think health professionals must do is now come to grips with the reality of climate risk and uncertainty and start to interpret it in terms of what that means for the health of our communities. Millions of people have already died and lost their livelihoods. Far more are going to because of climate. It is now, I think, the duty of professionals in all areas to start to raise that issue in public in a way we have never seen before. We need the school children, we need the Greta Thunbergs, we need every professional organization to recognize that this is the biggest threat that humanity faces and now to do something about it. But the starting point is to understand the threat. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. So many of you asked wonderful questions that were some version of what can we do? Or in the case of our colleagues from the Welcome, what can we fund? And there's an answer to that, and it means to tell the truth. Much of life in elite places and by elite people is based on deception, willful ignorance, self-deception. Marginalization reveals truth, but it deprives power, and power enfranchises, but it disguises reality. So terms like resource curse, which is just a way of offshoring greed. Those places aren't cursed by their own resources. They're cursed by the greed of other people. They're cursed by the colonizers. Climate change, it denies responsibility. You could just call that like carbon production by certain countries and name the countries. You know, historically, that's the United States, and today it's China. If you tell the truth, it gives you a place to act. So if you have some power, think about how to use it. Even a little bit of power can go a long way. Try to use it to enfranchise a voice that may be marginalized, and then listen to it. Redistribute that power. Think about it. Ask what we can do together. And when people start talking about communities in developing countries, yes, that's where you can find truth, but there aren't resources. It's unreasonable to expect action. That's a colonial pattern. That's where the wealth came from in the first place. So when the rich people want the next thing, they go back there and they try to extract again. I'm just asking you, tell the truth. That includes the way you live your life, the things that you say, the way you conduct yourself, the knowledge that you pursue. Tell the truth. Think about that. And thank you for joining us. It's been a great session. Fill out your evaluation forms. Thank you to Ian for joining us online. Thank you to the wonderful panelists, to our organizers and our secretariat here behind the black curtain. It's been a great day. Thanks a lot, everyone.